All right. Hi. Can you maybe introduce yourself and explain what you do and where you work?
Sure. I am a breaking news reporter for the Long Beach Post. Or my name is Valerie Osier, I guess. um, and so I primarily cover breaking news, but also kind of general assignment. And I do some engagement stuff like social media, that kind of thing. Um, and yeah, and right now we're kind of just covering coronavirus.
Yeah, and you're at your house,
Yes.
but this is just your day off. You're not always
Yeah.
at home reporting from home necessarily.
No, we have the option to report from or to work from home, but since we're kind of a closed loop in the office, right now we're still able to go in, and since journalists are essential, or considered essential workers, that we can be out and about if we need to be. So, but we do practice social distancing at the office. We do, wipe everything down, wash our hands, all that good stuff. So,
And
and I
maybe,
don't.
oh, go
Oh,
ahead.
sorry. Oh, and we're not. I don't think anybody's going out unnecessarily when they're home. So we're all quarantining when we're off.
If there's any time. Well, and I know my students at the beginning of the semester were really interested in like, how do you even get a job in journalism? So I know this
Mhm.
isn't related to the topic of interviewing and
Mhm.
reporting right now, but maybe a little bit about how you came in, because I think you have some of this, like a similar path to what my students
Mhm.
are, or the track that they're on right now at the community college.
Yeah. So I went to Riverside City College for 3 years, and I was on the newspaper there, and I worked really hard and um, there, and then I transferred to Cal State Long Beach, and I was again on the student newspaper. The key is being on the student newspaper and getting that
Yeah.
experience. And so I went to Long Beach State and graduated 2017. Um, and then I started freelancing for the Press Telegram, and um, I got really lucky, like pretty much, like my old advisor at Long Beach State connected me to the editor at the Press Telegram and recommended me as a freelancer, and the editor was so desperate for content because she didn't have that many reporters, that she was like, yeah, totally, here, do these stories. And I pitched some stories too, and then they had an opening for a news assistant, which was like a part-time job, and so I took it, or I mean, they offered it to me, pretty much, me and another guy. They offered it to both of us, and it was like calendar stuff. But Melissa, my editor, was pretty much like, I don't care about calendar stuff. I just need content. So go do stories, which was really lucky for me because I got to have experience writing stories. And then shortly after that, they had somebody left at their sister paper, the Daily Breeze, and they needed somebody to cover the Palos Verdes Peninsula because they have Southern California News Group has a newspaper up there, and it was literally one reporter and like a part-time editor. And so the one reporter, they were underpaying her like crazy, and when she asked for a raise, they said no, and so she's like, okay, I'm going to PR. So they hired me at the same rate that she was asking for, but that's beside the point. um, and so I got a full-time job reporting there, and I covered the peninsula for about 6 months, I think. And then I happened to, when they announced a bunch of layoffs at SoCal News Group, um, a lot of people took the buyouts, and um, and then so one of the reporters at the Press Telegram took a buyout, and so I went to work for the Press Telegram one day, um, to go to her like going away lunch thing, and then and they were talking about this whole thing where this local millionaire wanted to start a news, and he wanted to buy the Press Telegram but couldn't buy it, and so he was trying to start a newspaper in Long Beach, and I was like, hey, can I be part of this? And I was just really in the right place at the right time, and And they were like, yeah, sure. And so I just kind of kept bugging Tim, who was a columnist at the Press Telegram. And he was kind of the point person between him and John, or between all of us and John Molina. And I just kind of kept bugging him and saying, hey, like, I'll go to any meetings or whatever, like, I'll scheme with you guys, like, um, and so it kind of ended up being that John Molina decided to buy the Long Beach Post. And like, when it came down to it, they decided to hire me as well as several other people from the Press Telegram. So it was just a lot of pushing and being in the right place at the right time,
Yeah,
and working,
tenacity.
yeah, working hard, and that kind of thing. But a lot of luck too.
Well, you mentioned that, like, I don't think it's luck. I think it is
Yeah.
like the tenacity and the fact that, like you said, like pitching a lot of stories and having a lot of ideas, which is something I've made them already do, is kind of pitch stories and stuff. So what's like the story pitch? Like, how do you come up with story ideas in general? And then how has that kind of changed now that you're like full-time kind of coronavirus coverage?
I don't think the pitching process really changes. It's what you're curious about. What do you want to know? Especially when, like, I'm really lucky that I get to cover my own community. So, things I see, just going on a walk with my husband, and I'm like, huh, what's that about? And I can look into it, and that's a story. And that's kind of how it's always been. Like, I remember when I was gonna have a meeting before I started freelancing with Melissa at the Press Telegram. I kind of waited till last minute, but the night before I was like, I need story ideas. Like, I need to be able to pitch her stuff, because you have to, even though she ended up having some like stories that she needed me to cover. I wanted to have like 2 or 3 solid ideas
Yeah,
to
that's not
bring to
always
her.
the case.
Right. Yeah, that's never the case. Like,
Yeah, rarely.
it was literally because she was so low staffed at the Press Telegram that she was like, I have these specific things that need to be covered. And I was like, cool, I'll do them. But here also, I have ideas and I am useful. But I was looking through city council agendas for the past like few weeks prior. And I was like, okay, I know there's story ideas in here. And I checked, I looked in the consent calendar, where I was like, what's this about? That's stuff that they kind of gloss over at the beginning of the meeting, and they like pass. It's a lot of like fluffy stuff, but you can find good story ideas in there, like even if they're just feature stories. And so I was like, oh, there's this big program that they approved that helps people not go to jail and get mental health help. And so I was like, well, they haven't written about that. And I looked it up. So you find stuff that you're curious about, you look it up to see if it's already been written, and if it hasn't, that's the story that you pitch. And with coronavirus, it's kind of the same thing. Like with my religion story, like it was something I was experiencing in my day-to-day life. Like, I had my pastor was uh, you know like, my church meets at a school, and when they shut down the schools to outside groups, they shut down all of the churches that meet inside schools. So they rent the space every week. And so we were essentially kicked out of our building. And so I was like, hey, there's dozens of churches that meet in schools in Long Beach. And that's a huge thing if they're not able to meet because of this. And this was before even like the lockdowns and stuff like that, or not the lockdowns, the like stay at home orders and stuff like that. And so my church was kind of scrambling to figure it out. And I was like, I know we're not the only church that's scrambling. And they were struggling with like, do they like, and I was like, I'm not going to church, guys. I don't want to get sick. I don't want to get anybody else sick. But I think for the first week they met at a park, just like a small part of it. And that was like kind of before like they started really seeing the seriousness of it. And but now they're just straight to live streaming. And so I wanted to see like, okay, well, how is this affecting other churches? How is this affecting other faiths? And I wanted to like reach out to the like, and so I was able to actually talk to a lot of different faith organizations and stuff like that, and figure that out. So that was cool.
So it really does start, and this is a process that I've gotten them on, that I've told them about, that reporting is observation, research, and interviews. Those are like the reporting basics. So it sounds like you said, your curiosity comes from your observations. So you're observing your everyday life, and then you're doing research on it to see like, okay, how does this fit into the context? Then you make your pitch, and then you go out and you do your interviews, you do some more research, right? And then you come up with a story. And so, because we talked about it before I hit record, Valerie wrote the story that I put into our Dropmark links about how how different faith organizations are dealing with coronavirus. And like you said, you wrote it kind of in the week in between, like when they banned gatherings of 250, but we weren't in a shelter in place mode yet. And yet the final product, the final article, it started with your experience. I mean, the article itself didn't start with your experience, but the nexus of the pitch started with your experience. But you didn't only talk to churches. Like you said, you talked to, we have a lot of mosques here. We have several synagogues and Jewish community centers here. How did you go about finding or figuring out your sources that are maybe outside of your personal circle? Because you might know your pastor, but how do you talk to churches? Because you can't report on your own church because that's a conflict of interest. So how did you find other churches and other pastors, and then reach out to maybe faith-based organizations that you weren't connected with? Because finding your sources to interview is a big step of this process that they're learning right now too.
Yeah. So so a lot of the sources are sources that I've actually kind of had some previous experience with. Like I knew, like, to reach out to a synagogue, I was like, oh, I've been to what are they called?
Oh, the Alpert.
The Alpert, yeah. They're Jewish community center, and I know that they're very open to, outsiders talking to them, and like, even participating in their services. And so I was like, okay, I know I can go there. And so I went there, but they had ended early, and so I was like, I physically went there. This was before, before the like shelter in place stuff. But I physically went there. And they had already left, and I had expected them to be there until like a certain time, because I knew that they have like a after Shabbat lunch together usually, but they had already left because they canceled that lunch to do social distancing. But then there was one guy there that I was able to talk to, and he was like asking me questions, and he was all skeptical about the whole social, like everything. So it is really interesting to get his perspective. For mosques, I Googled mosques in Long Beach and I found the Islamic Center of Long Beach, and I went there and nobody was there, but I observed like tarps on the ground, and I was like, why is there like a yellow tarp plastic sheet on the ground, inside, like through the windows in the prayer area. And then there was a guy in a car in the parking lot, and he was like, hey, can I help you? And I was like, oh yeah, I'm just looking for a leader, anybody who works here. And he's like, oh, I can give you the imam's number. And I was like, oh, cool. So he gave me the imam's number, and I called him later, and he was really helpful and willing to be interviewed over the phone. He was like, oh yeah, we put those plastic tarps on the ground so that people don't touch the floor when they're praying. And I was like, oh, okay. And he's like, yeah, that's different from what we normally do. And so that was like an observation that I made while I was there, even if it was just through the windows,
and then brought it into the interview.
Yeah And then what else? Oh, and then Steven, my husband, who's also a journalist, he actually helped me by calling a bunch of different Buddhist temples in Long Beach, and to find many of them don't speak English. So that was kind of hard. I'm like, I don't speak any other language. And so he kind of called around, and he was able to find someone from the Long Beach Buddhist church, which is still just a Buddhist temple. They just kind of call it church, which is kind of funny. I kind of thought that was interesting. And so he talked to them how they were changing their practices, and the guy told him that, like, yeah, we have a lot of like almost 100-year-olds we canceled right away, like we're just doing meditations, some meditations like on Zoom. And I was like, wow, that's crazy. So he helped me a lot there. And then for one church, I had a contact with a pastor. Actually, I knew two pastors beforehand. One who I had like known from a long time ago at Cal State Long Beach, and then another guy who I'd met at an officer involved shooting, and we became he's like, yeah, I'm a pastor, and he's really like connected in the Black pastoral community, or the Black community and the pastor community. And so when there's officer involved shootings, he'll go out and try to like mediate between the police and the Black community a lot of times. So I had built that source from a long time ago, and I was like, hey dude, how are you doing? Can I talk to you about how this is affecting your church? And so yeah, that's how it kind of unfolded, I guess.
So with your line of questioning, like, how do you come up with questions to ask them? It sounds like you just sort of made an opener and then the conversation flowed from there. But how do you prepare for interviews like this when you're doing news writing as opposed to like a profile piece on someone? You know, you're reporting on the fly. You don't necessarily know the answers to your questions yet. How do you come up with open-ended questions to ask and to keep the conversation going to get what you need?
Yeah, I kind of think like I try to make a list of what I need to find out. Like I need to find out if their meetings have changed, or if their way of worship has changed because of this. I need to find out how that works out technically, how that fits into their scheduling. And so I kind of just figure out what I need to know, like, and I just say like, and I ask them those questions. You know, you don't say like, has this changed? Like, you don't say like, for example, like, has this changed how you do services? You say, how has this changed how you do services? You know, that kind of thing where it's open-ended and it's not a yes and no question. And then if you do accidentally ask a yes and no question, you say, oh wait, can you elaborate on that? And that kind of thing.
So you don't go in with like a set list of questions. I think a lot of beginning journalists try and do that, and it makes for like very stilted interviews, you know, where you're just sort of reading off and then they answer it and you go, okay. And you go to the next question, and you're not really, it prevents you sometimes from listening to the answers and coming up with follow-up questions. So, I mean, even when you were starting out, did you find that you were able to make them into conversations, or did you start off with like writing specific questions down and following your questions until it was over and you go back and then you listen to your interview and you're like, crap, I didn't get what I needed?
Yeah. I kind of think everybody starts that way. You start off with like a long list of questions, and then you're like, oh, this doesn't sound conversational at all. Or, you know, like, so I think now I kind of start with, like I said, what I need to know. You know, sometimes if it's like a very important interview and I'm like, I have 5 seconds to ask this person, you know, 5 things, then I will write down those questions and I just kind of double check the questions beforehand. But if it's but I think you kind of have to take like principles that like I learned in like speech class, for example, at community college, that you know, you use bullet points. You don't write down every single thing you're gonna say, you know, like, so you're not like reading off a sentence. You write down like the core idea, you know, and then you go from there, and your brain kind of fills it out on the fly. So I think that's what I'll do if I'm like in a rush usually. Yeah, it's mostly just like knowing what you need to know, pretty much.
What was the turnaround on that story, for example? Like, how much time do you have between I'm going to do that and my editor needs it?
So I had pitched it kind of like on Thursday or Friday, but like and then my editor was like, yeah, that might be a good like story later on, but we have all these other important stories to do. And I was like, yeah, fair. You know, but then on Saturday morning, because I work Saturdays, my editor was like, hey, so they made this big announcement about gatherings of more than 250 people, like this is going to affect churches. And I was like, that's what I said. and and he's like, can you put together a story today about that? And then originally he said like, oh, I'm fine if you interview your own pastor. And I was like, nope, I'm not cool with that. That's weird. Even if that's like okay with you, even if we just closed it, I'd feel weird about interviewing my own pastor. And so I was like, I'm just going to report the crap out of this. And so it was Saturday morning, and I just, I did my morning like check-ins with police and stuff like that, like if there were any overnight shootings. And then I, messaged some of the pastors I knew, and then I was like, wait a second, this can't just be like, how is this affecting the evangelical Christian church? Like, no, that's dumb.
Mm-hmm.
And I was like, no, this Long Beach is a really diverse city, and we need to like check in with all the other religions, and so then I started looking for other sources, and then I went to one church, a Lutheran church, because they were actually the church that was going to let my church use it, but then ended up canceling. So I was interviewing that pastor, and I was like, okay, I feel comfortable with that. I don't want to interview my own pastor though. That's not right for me. And so I interviewed him, and he was like kind of the like, oh, it's fine if we shake hands. And I was like, no, dude, I'm good. You're like 100 years old, don't die. Like, and yeah, so we went out there to get photos too, and then we stopped by the Jewish Center, and then we stopped by the Islamic Center, and then we came back home, and then I started writing up what I had. I think I took a break because I was kind of stressed out. Like in the middle of the day, I was like, oh my gosh. And then I think I finished that story around like 7 or 8 on that Saturday. So I kind of started 10, and I finished.
You did all the reporting in one day.
Yeah.
And
it
no, go ahead.
Oh, I mean, and I could have like done a really beautiful feature, like, and even like after I did, I was like, dang, I should have opened up with this. I should have asked the imam like more detailed questions, like about the tarps and like how they would normally do it, and like all this stuff. And I could have opened with it. It would have been really cool feature opening, And I was kind of like, kicking myself over that. But I was like, wait a second, I did the reporting, all of that in one day, and I talked to like 7 people. Yeah. Like, I'm fine. Hang on, I need to plug my phone in. It's like 1%. Okay.
We're good. Yeah, that's super impressive, but that's typical. I mean, and you're a breaking news reporter traditionally, or your main job is breaking news. So you're used to writing those kinds of things on quick turnaround, actually going out and getting a story that does 7 interviews. And what you did is exactly what my students are going to have to do, but they have 3 weeks to do it. So I'm letting them know how lucky they are. They get a little more time. It's their first one, so they're getting some time to spread it out. And I like that you ended up doing more of an inverted pyramid with like a hard, with a basic news lead that still is descriptive. Because that's kind of what they're going to have to be doing. We haven't really gotten into feature writing yet, but I think you got the point across on it. So basically, now that we are under this shelter-in-place order, like you said, your media is essential, so you can technically go out. But I'm respectful of my students' health, and so how are you deciding when to go out and do interviews and reporting and observations in person? And when are you deciding to do phone interviews? Because Journalism 101 says shoe leather reporting, walk the street, talk to people in person. And this is a very different time where I can't force that right now. And I don't want to either. But usually we always say, go and talk to them, go to the source, go to the mosque or go to the temple and see who's there, as opposed to just calling and emailing. So how are you like finding sources without going out, which is we call it lazy journalism usually, but now it's sort of necessity journalism. And then how are you deciding when to interview people in person? How do you interview them in person versus like phone interviews? Or are you even doing email interviews or text message interviews, which are really frowned upon traditionally in journalism, but they really have to happen now?
Yeah. I know, like Stephanie the other day was like, my coworker Stephanie was working on a story, and she's super busy the other day. She was trying to talk to this person. She's like, "Hey, we're gonna have to do this interview over text message." And I like when she said that, I was like, and then I was like, "Oh yeah, like the times that we're living in right now." Like, and she was so busy that it was just like, yeah, that made sense. And it was a very small part of, I think, her story that she was working on. But it just kind of like shocked me for a second, because I was like, whoa, that's weird. But yeah, I mean, I haven't had to do like I haven't, other than that story, I haven't been doing much beyond like officials, like I've been, on the phone with officials and going to press conferences or listening to press conferences now. But when we are looking for sources who are like normal people, we've been doing call outs on social media. Like on Instagram, it's been really helpful. Like we'll put a little question thing like, hey, how's last week we did it was before the school shut down, and they were like, so we asked, what are you going to do if the school shut down, and or parents,
Mm-hmm.
and then I responded through our branded account to some of the people who had responded to that question with like, when they said, I don't know what I'm going to do, like, my kid, like, I'm going to have to take him to work with me or something, and so I responded to those people. I sent out like 8, I think, and because that's all I had time for. And then I got like 3 responses back, and I was like, hey, can I talk to you? And they were like, yeah, totally. And so I interviewed them over the phone, and that's how we got some regular people. A lot of times right now, like especially like we just did a grocery store video that I wasn't part of, but my husband was, and he he had to go to the grocery store and then talk to people who were there because it was in context and it was a video, but they're trying to figure out how to do interviews from far away but still get good audio. And it's just like a whole thing that so you kind of have to decide, like, can I get this from, like, can I get the voice that I need to get in this story from like putting a call out, on social media, preferably on like a branded account, so then you're not interviewing your own circle of people. Or is this something where I have to get somebody like in context in the place, and that's just kind of and you can still interview people from far away, not like from 6 feet away,
Yeah, what's that experience like if you are, so let's say you do go out, how are you protecting yourself and protecting the people that you're interviewing? If any of my students do decide to go out and observe in person and they do want to talk to someone, what kind of protocols are you doing?
I mean, the 6 feet away, we have our press badges on, so they kind of know like, hey, I'm a press person, and what else?
How are you recording the interview? Like with like, does your voice recorder like reach that far, or are you really relying more on your notes or?
Notes. I mean, I don't really record interviews that often, especially for if it's a quick turnaround story, I don't generally record my interviews. If it's a longer term story, but we're not right now because everything's changing so fast from coronavirus. Like it's really hard to work on any long term story. Like, I wrote that religion story a week ago, and it's already moot. Like, imagine if I had been working on like a long feature or like something that was, I would have had to redo probably not all of them, but I would have had to redo like a handful of those interviews because I'd have been like, that it's not the same anymore, that it's changed so fast. Everything changes day to day. So what they're telling us to do is like, if you're working on a story, do it and get it done like now, because it's going to change,
Yeah. What a year this week has been.
Yeah. So, that's why it might be kind of hard for your students to work on a story over a period of 3 weeks because things are changing so fast in regards to this. So kind of either anticipating they might have to redo an interview, or I don't know, like,
Yeah, I've told them like we just have to kind of put a cap or an end date on it. I mean, we're not going to be getting out of this shelter in place mode. So I think operating under this circumstance right now is the best way to go about it. And then understanding that you're going to have to turn it in at some point, and it might, you can only write about what you know in that moment.
Yeah.
And so having sort of a published date in mind, let's say, of like whenever the midterm is due. So yeah, things are moving quickly, but I think that the one thing that will be static in 2 or 3 weeks is that we're all stuck at home, whether we're in a voluntary shelter in place where people are still going out, which is right now, or whether in a couple of days we get like a more forceful lockdown where we're not allowed to leave our houses. I think the impacts of that, and of job loss, and of a lot of the things that my students are thinking about, like they're wondering about their graduation, like how is this going to impact them graduating? I mean, it won't, matriculation wise is sort of the answer. I know I have another student who's interested in how the seniors and the elderly are getting their shopping done, which was the video, right? That was the video you guys did.
Yeah.
Was going early in the morning and interviewing the seniors that are taking advantage of those early morning hours. People are worried about job loss, obviously, the economic impacts. Those are not things that are going away right now. And so figuring out who they can interview and how they can find those people to interview. So maybe if they don't have like main social media accounts, reaching out to their circles to reach out to their circles, and kind of getting a couple of degrees of separation away from whoever, but putting out a call to your family and your family group text, like, hey, do you know anyone who's experiencing this? Or
like, I mean, even for the religion story, like I did text my pastor and I was like, hey, do you know any pastors who are being affected by this? So it was like, and then he was like, oh yeah, talk to the pastor that's going to let us use his church. And I was like, oh, cool. Like, I'll talk to him, because that's like a degree of separation that I was way more comfortable with.
Right.
So there was, reaching out to your circles or people who, like a leader or somebody who is like if I know a server and I want to know how they're being impacted, and I would say, hey, can you hook me up with one of your coworkers, and say to interview for a story, and then they'll help you, hopefully.
Yeah, we really have to, I think we as journalists have to rely on our networks and the gatekeepers that we know to link us to other people kind of along the way on this.
Yeah.
Okay. And kind of, so a final question, because we're talking about like modes or methods of interviewing in this time. What would you say maybe pros and cons of like phone interviews versus email interviews? Because email interviews are like almost as frowned upon. Like, I loved your face with the text message.
Yeah.
That's totally what I would have done too, even though it happens in the newsroom, especially if you're interviewing students, because students are often more comfortable being interviewed. Like when the students are interviewing student athletes, it's usually via Instagram DM, or because you can't get them on the phone, but they'll DM you back during class or something. So you can kind of get answers from them that way.
Yeah.
But what are like pros and cons with email interviews? I'm really going to try and discourage email interviews. So I prefer phone, but.
Yeah, phone interviews. So email interviews are kind of hard because just the structure of them, like visually, like on the screen, it's like really annoying to be like, wait, but you said 3 messages down that da 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 da, and then you know what I mean? Like,
follow-ups are hard.
Yeah, it's really hard with follow-ups. I would, if you're gonna do like a text-based interview, I would rather do like a text message, just so it's like faster and like more like right there, But I would still rather do phone interviews over that. And phone interviews aren't hard. The only thing that kind of stinks with phone interviews is that like sometimes you're like, you think they're done and then they're not done, and then like you talk over them and you're like, oh wait, what were you gonna say? That sounded like you were going on an interesting tangent, so that's the only issue with phones. But that's like, when you don't have the physical body language to to like cue when somebody's done talking, you know what I mean? So video interviews like this would be a good idea, a good medium.
In the scheme of types of interviews that students can do right now, we're going to do like video, in person if you feel comfortable, and you can you can keep social distance. Video interviews, then are ideal, then phone interviews, then you were saying like text message interviews kind of above email, like email's like sort of a last resort.
Yeah, I mean, just because just the time it takes, you know, from one answer to the other, I think it's kind of silly.
Yeah, it's hard for follow-ups.
Yeah.
Maybe okay and good for like fact checking and verification.
Yeah.
But not for getting quotes and for getting a feel for things.
Yeah.
Cool.
Sometimes I think emails are too formal too. So like if you send like a list of questions via email and then they type you an essay and you're like, great, this sounds like an essay, you know, and they're like, don't. But if it's like a back and forth text where it's more conversational, I think it lends probably more naturally to the conversational tone.
It also gives them a lot of opportunity to think about their answers and to structure them and to like sound not like themselves if it's an email, because they're thinking, like you said, it's formal. So they're like thinking, oh, I'm going to sound smarter. Hold on. And they'll like edit their answers. So you're not really getting like genuine answers necessarily.
Right. Yeah. I think interviews are only good with like officials who are going to give you canned answers anyways. You know?
That's true. And they will have to talk to officials to confirm some things too. Well, I really appreciate you taking time out of your one day off. I know it's a really hectic time to be reporting right now. So we really appreciate you taking the time to talk to students. Telling them. Yeah. So, and good luck in all your reporting and stuff this week and in future weeks.
Yes, it's gotta be. Bye.